Today we're going to talk about the Declaration of Independence and some things about the Declaration that you may not know, or that you may not have realized. I also call this show not only the Declaration of Independence, but I also call this show America is the Way. And I'll explain that as we get into this. But first, let's get some history behind the Declaration of Independence. From June 11th to June 27th of 1776, there was a committee of five that worked on the Declaration of Independence for the Second Continental Congress. On July the 2nd of 1776, the Second Continental Congress voted for independence, and on July 4th, they approved the Declaration of Independence as we know it today. And that's when the signing started, and when John Hancock wrote his big John Hancock, and he said, well, this way the British won't need spectacles to read my name. Also, too, I'm told that at the signing of the Declaration of Independence, Charles Carroll, who is a Catholic from Maryland, wrote his name Charles Carroll. And then one of the other delegates said, oh, well, there's so many other Charles Carrolls. You could say that it wasn't you. And so Charles Carroll then got up and said, Charles Carroll of Carrollton, he wrote, Maryland. Okay. July 9th, my understanding is the declaration was read to the troops who were fighting the British, and by August the 6th of 1776, all the signatures were on the Declaration of Independence. We're going to end this talk with a reading of the Declaration of Independence. So without further ado, we are trained, we are taught to see the document as just simply ordering domestic society, of ordering America. And my last show, I talked about Robert Reilly's book, and we talk about the four major principles that he talks about in his book as ordering American domestic society. And these are the right to remove tyrants, the self-determination of peoples, consent of the governed, powers given to the rulers as people see fit. These are all concepts that Reilly talks about, and he puts forth their provenance going all the way back to the Middle Ages and antiquity, and he explains how these ideas came to the founders by way of primarily of Algernon Sidney, who lived in the 1600s, but who also studied Suarez and Bellarmine. Well, there's more here. This is not just a document about right ordering a domestic society, about America. It's a document that says there is a connection between the domestic societies in the world, the many different countries, and the international society, the community of nations. It is a statement that these two societies are interrelated, that they must be right ordered, and that the founders knew this connection and they knew the need of right ordering these societies. Now, this is an idea that is also put forth in the modern era, most prominently, I believe, by Pope St John XXIII in Pacem In Terris. He basically says you have to right order the domestic and the international societies on the same basis, which is the primacy of the person, among other things. The primacy of the person is the fundamental doctrine, touchstone, principle upon which you right order domestic and international societies. And indeed, popes and leaders before that said you get international problems, you get international wars when domestic societies become disordered. Okay, so the founders knew of this connection between the importance of right ordered domestic societies and right ordered international societies, and it came out in the Declaration of Independence. And it's not readily apparent to a lot of people, but you have to study it. So the founders knew, and they accepted four key principles to right ordering nations or peoples and the world, and these were ultimately, I submit to you, Catholic principles, principles that came from the philosophers of antiquity, through the church fathers, through St. Thomas Aquinas, to the School of Salamanca with Francisco Vitoria, who was Dominican, and Francisco Suarez, who was a Jesuit. It affected Bellarmine to an extent, but from the School of Salamanca, the ideas went over to Grotius, who was greatly influenced by Francisco Suarez, Hugo Grotius, a Dutch lawyer, and then went to Pufendorf, a German lawyer, Wolff, Christian Wolff, somewhat to Beyerbach, and then to Aymar de Vattel, who was a Swiss lawyer. So the lawyers took these ideas and they transmitted them from generation to generation. They ended up with the founders. And Aymar de Vattel, as I've written, as I've talked about before, wrote a book called Law of Nations. Very popular among the founders. They all read it. They all understood it. It had all the principles of right ordering, domestic and international society, and said there's a connection between the two. And I talked about them in this big long book that consists of four books that I have read, and that sets forth these principles that are held to this day by the American elites, by our elites. And these four principles were passed down from the founders through their own lineage. Okay, they came down through a man by the name of Chancellor James Kent, who was a lawyer from New York, and he was called the Blackstone. He was called the Blackstone of America, and his writings, his work affected generations of lawyers in the 1800s. So it goes down through Kent, it goes to James Brown Scott, you've heard me talk about, very important, very influential person. He was the guy who said international law is actually Catholic, and it comes from the School of Salamanca. He changed 4 centuries or 3 centuries of thought, thinking that international law only came from Hugo Grotius. But James Brown Scott, and then after that, Cordell Hull, who set up the UN, and then on down to the current day. So, what are these four principles that the founders, I submit, understood and lived by, and that formed America and our dealings with the world? The four principles are, and also our domestic society. These four principles also formed our domestic society. One, it's the primacy of the person. And you can get more details, really interesting. You can get more details about all of these if you read Pacem In Terris. Because Pacem In Terris by John the 23rd is a very good distillation of these concepts. And they're based on the natural law. And so, what are these four principles? The primacy of the person, the existence of a community of nations. You know, we're not some anarchic group like Mearsheimer says. We're actually a community of nations. The centrality of law in right ordering. Now, what we're talking about here is we're talking about the positivistic law, we're talking about the civil law, the local law, but we're also talking about the law of nations, which is conventions, treaties, custom, and the natural law, which are certain principles of right ordering society that people know from a variety of different sources by their intellect, even from the Ten Commandments. But these are principles that are first things. They're first principles, and from them come other principles, part of which form the law of nations, which are also based on custom, and so on. So centrality of law in right ordering, going all the way back to the natural law of society. The natural law is based on the eternal law. So we got the primacy of the person, the existence of the community of nations, the centrality of law and right ordering, and then fourth, peace is the natural state of man. This is the idea you see over and over again with Americans. So I'm going to develop these more in time, but I wanted to mention these four principles because they were carried to the founders and from the founders to our common day, to our present day rather. These help to form the UN, the United Nations, and help to form the world order that we live in now. And they have brought a great deal of peace and prosperity to the world. Okay, so it is the acceptance of these ideas and putting them on paper that I believe makes America the model state of the world community. It shows the world the way. And I think it shows the world the right way of ordering the domestic and the international. James Brown Scott wrote a book entitled The United States of America, A Study in International Organization. And in it, he sets forth a very good argument that America presented the way of how the countries of the world can get together and form this community, this juridical entity, this political entity. Like we did in the United States, of course, based on federalism and liberalism to bring people together, and based on the natural law. But he in this book lays this out, how this is a model for the world. And it is a long-held human belief, ideal, Catholic belief, Catholic ideal, that not only is there a community of nations, but that there should be a global political entity juridical entity that brings everybody together to coordinate everything everyone is doing to help all the countries, to help all the states, help their people, and to do the right thing in accordance with these principles and in accordance with right order. Because no one state can do it all alone and needs others to do it. And so this international organization would be a juridical entity which would ensure right order, justice, and peace by what it did. And again, I'll talk more about this in the future. I just want to give you the outlines here. So, America is a way to realize this long held, long believed Christian idea one world government. And this is why America, in many ways, is the model international citizen. And it's the model of social organization and with the international and the domestic brought together. And it is a world leader, and it's the way. So, let's talk about some passages from Epstein's works that support here what I'm saying. In 1953, he wrote Code of International Ethics with the IUSS, the International Union of Social Scientists, which was under the observation, under the control, the mentorship, if you will, of Catholic prelates, to include Cardinal Van Roey and Archbishop Keogh of Baltimore. And Epstein wrote in Code of International Ethics that, quote, mankind therefore constitutes a single family, and no difference of race, color, language, or nationality can hide the indestructible unity of that family. He goes on to say that each person contributes to the common good and exists in, quote, a system of relationships of ever-growing complexities, families, townships, professions, states, that eventually affects the human race as a whole. He says that each state, in order to provide the full good of human life to each of its members, can only do so if all states mutually assist one another. Citing to St. Augustine, the family, the political society, and international society, domus, urbs, and orbis, are institutions of natural law, since they correspond to certain fundamental needs of human nature. The fundamental parts of the natural law, the Declaration of Independence, we see this recognition by the American founders, and that's crucial. That's huge. So in 1935, Epstein, in his book, The Catholic Tradition and the Law of Nations, I think that's the right title of it, he got a papal medal for it. He writes that the law of nations serves better than any other English term to indicate at once the natural and moral basis of the rules obtaining between peoples and the positive forms given to those rules. It would, however, be inaccurate to translate jus gentium in St. Thomas as international law in the modern sense of interstate law. So he's making a distinction between these first principles and principles that arise from the first principles versus a more positivistic view of interstate relations. The body of rights, he goes on to write, the body of rights to which he was referring as belonging to, as all people possessing and as coming from God are the following. He writes, the right to conserve themselves in being, to develop according to their nature, to hold property, to bequeath it, to trade, to travel freely, to which we might add the right to speak their maternal language, to follow their own domestic and religious customs, so they be not contrary to natural law, to choose or obey their own local authorities. And I might add that Epstein's book references Pius XII and a number of other authorities that talk about these fundamental body of rights that everybody has, that people have, all peoples around the world. And again, the object of all this is for the development of the person, the betterment of the person, the fulfillment of the person, not the squashing of a person, reducing him to some meat sickle, but the person with an intellect, with reason, with a body, with a soul, the ability to appreciate culture, ideas, all of that. All of these laws in the jus gentium, all of these rules in the jus gentium help the person. And these are the rights that all the peoples everywhere have, which is what Epstein just said. Okay, so it is in part to protect these rights that first civil society, then international society is formed. The jus gentium is in a sense the end to which international law is the means. For the object of conventions between states is directly or indirectly to promote the welfare of the families that compose them, and this welfare comprises the exercise of all the rights contained in the jus gentium as well as those arising from the law of nature itself. Such parts of the traditional jus gentium as plainly concern public relations between states, as for instance the immunity of ambassadors, pertain to international law in the modern sense, and they can only be changed by agreement between states. Okay. So when we look at the Declaration of Independence, what we see is a list of grievances where we saw these rights of the Americans, the jus gentium of the Americans, a separate and distinct people, were basically lost. They were being destroyed. They were being taken away by George III and Parliament. And as Charles Beard wrote, the plutocrats that ran the British Empire. He estimates in one of his books, Charles Beard estimates that there were about 10,000 plutocrats, landed aristocracy primarily, in England who ran the whole show. They had the power, the wealth, the political influence, and so they would shift costs of doing business. So they would not have to foot the cost, and so that's why they would push for enactment of certain acts concerning the colonies regarding taxes or whatever it may be throughout the 1760s, 1770s, so that would help the plutocrats' bottom line. And so the colonists, in short, without any representation, were basically used by these plutocrats to advance the bottom line of the plutocrats. Well, that's a definition of tyranny. Okay, so Americans were being beggared. I've said this before. The Americans were being beggared. Couldn't manufacture, couldn't mint money to pay the bills, and we had no representation, just for starters. But there's more. If you as you read, as you listen to the Declaration of Independence, you see that laws were not being made. So without laws, without rules to govern society, you don't have a right order society. You have a jungle. You have savagery. Okay, which is what Russia and China want now. So you got savagery. So what America wanted, and Americans wanted rules. They wanted laws, and they had to depend on England. They wanted the rule of law. Okay, they wanted the rule of law, and George wasn't giving it to them. It was arbitrary and capricious. Lost the protection of the crown. That's why the Indians were attacked them, others were attacked them. Trade was limited. Again, this is a fundamental right. This is a right that Victoria in the School of Salamanca saw belonging to all people. Travel was restricted. And of course, this is again another fundamental right seen by the Salamanca School. And we go on and on. And then, of course, there's also arbitrary rule by the crown and by the parliament, arbitrary rule to the harm of the Americans. So, the Declaration of Independence, we see something very fundamental: the recognition of the union of the domestic and the international societies. They have to be right ordered in accordance with the jus gentium, or the law of nations, or the natural law. Uh, and Then, of course, we have the four principles: the primacy of the person, the existence of a community of nations, not some anarchic, world order with power blocks, but a community of all nations of the world. Um, the importance of the rule of law, all the way going back to the eternal law, the natural law, and then, of course, right ordered civil law. And then finally, peace is the natural order of mankind. These four principles are there in the Declaration. Um, and what I'm going to do without any further ado is read to you the Declaration of Independence. Um, in certain places, we would say attention to orders, and everyone would stand. But by watching this and by reading the Declaration of Independence, you are giving a great honor. So, without further ado, the Declaration of Independence in Congress, July 4th, 1776. The unanimous declaration of the 13 United States of America. When in the course of human events it becomes necessary for one people to dissolve the political bands which have connected them with another, and to assume among the powers of the earth the separate and equal station to which the laws of nature, sorry I get choked up, the laws of nature and nature's God entitle them, a decent respect to the opinions of mankind requires that they should declare the causes which impel them to the separation. We hold these truths to be self-evident: that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that amongst these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed, that whenever any form of government becomes destructive of these ends, it is the right of the people to alter or to abolish it, and to institute new government, laying its foundation on such principles and organizing its powers in such form as to them shall seem most likely to effect their safety and happiness. Prudence, indeed, will dictate that governments long established should not be changed for light and transient causes, and accordingly all experience hath shewn that mankind are more disposed to suffer while evils are sufferable, than to right themselves by abolishing the forms to which they are accustomed. But when a long train of abuses and usurpations, pursuing invariably the same object, evinces a design to reduce them under absolute despotism, it is their right, it is their duty, to throw off such government and to provide new guards for their future security. Such has been the patient sufferance of these colonies, and such is now the necessity which constrains them to alter their former systems of government. The history of the present King of Great Britain is a history of repeated injuries and usurpations, all having in direct object the establishment of an absolute tyranny over these states. To provide this, let facts be submitted to a candid world. He has refused his assent to laws the most wholesome and necessary for the public good. He has forbidden his governors to pass laws of immediate and pressing importance, unless suspended in their operation till his assent should be obtained, and when so suspended he has utterly neglected to attend to them. He has refused to pass other laws for the accommodation of large districts of people, unless these people would relinquish the right of representation in the legislature, a right inestimable to them and formidable to tyrants only. He has called together legislative bodies at places unusual, uncomfortable, and distant from the depository of their public records for the sole purpose of fatiguing them into compliance with his measures. He has dissolved representative houses repeatedly for opposing with manly firmness his invasions on the rights of the people. He has refused for a long time after such dissolutions to cause others to be elected, whereby the legislative powers incapable of annihilation have returned to the people at large for their exercise, the state remaining in the meantime exposed to all the dangers of invasion from without and convulsions within. He has endeavored to prevent the population of these states, for that purpose obstructing the laws for naturalization of foreigners, refusing to pass others to encourage their migrations hither, and raising the conditions of new appropriations of lands. He has obstructed the administration of justice by refusing his assent to laws for establishing judiciary powers. He has made judges dependent on his will alone for the tenure of their offices and the amount and payment of their salaries. He has erected a multitude of new offices and sent hither swarms of officers to harass our people and eat out their substance. He has kept among us in times of peace standing armies without the consent of our legislatures. He has affected to render the military independent of and superior to the civil power. He has combined with others to subject us to a jurisdiction foreign to our Constitution and unacknowledged by our laws, giving his assent to their acts of pretended legislation. For quartering large bodies of armed troops among us, for protecting them by a mock trial from punishment for any murders which they should commit on the inhabitants of these states, for cutting off our trade with all parts of the world, for imposing taxes on us without our consent, for depriving us in many cases of the benefits of trial by jury, for transporting us beyond seas to be tried for pretended offenses, for abolishing the free system of English laws in a neighboring province, establishing therein an arbitrary government, and enlarging its boundaries so as to render it at once an example and fit instrument for introducing the same absolute rule into these colonies, for taking away our charters, abolishing our most valuable laws, and altering fundamentally the forms of our governments, for suspending our own legislatures and declaring themselves invested with powers to legislate for us in all cases whatsoever. He has abdicated government here by declaring us out of his protection and waging war against us. He has plundered our seas, ravaged our coasts, burnt our towns, and destroyed the lives of our people. He is at this time transporting large armies of foreign mercenaries to complete the works of death, desolation, and tyranny, already begun with circumstances of cruelty and perfidy scarcely paralleled in the most barbarous ages and totally unworthy the head of a civilized nation. He has constrained our fellow citizens taken captive on the high seas to bear arms against their country, to become the executioners of their friends and brethren, or to fall themselves by their hands. He has excited domestic insurrections among us, and he has endeavored to bring on the inhabitants of our frontiers the merciless Indian savages, whose known rule of warfare is an undistinguished destruction of all ages, sexes, and conditions. In every stage of these oppressions, we have petitioned for redress in the most humble terms. Our repeated petitions have been answered only by repeated injury. A prince whose character is thus marked by every act which may define a tyrant is unfit to be the ruler of a free people. Nor have we been wanting in attention to our British brethren. We have warned them from time to time of attempts by their legislatures to extend an unwarrantable jurisdiction over us. We have reminded them of the circumstances of our emigration and settlement here. We have appealed to their native justice and magnanimity, and we have conjured them by the ties of our common kindred to disavow these usurpations, which would inevitably interrupt our connections and correspondence. They too have been deaf to the voice of justice and to consanguinity. We must therefore acquiesce in the necessity which denounces our separation and hold them, as we hold the rest of mankind, enemies in war, in peace friends. We therefore, the representatives, this is powerful. We therefore, the representatives of the United States of America, in General Congress assembled, appealing to the Supreme Judge of the world for the rectitude of our intentions, do in the name and by authority of the good people of these colonies, solemnly publish and declare that these united colonies are, and of right ought to be, free and independent states. That they are absolved from all allegiance to the British Crown. That all political connection between them and the state of Great Britain is and ought to be totally dissolved. And that as free and independent states, they have full power to levy war, conclude peace, contract alliances, establish commerce, and to do all other acts and things which independent states may have right to, and for the support of this declaration, with a firm reliance on the protection of divine providence, we mutually pledge to each other our lives, our fortunes, and our sacred honor. The signers from Georgia were Button Gwinnett, Lyman Hall, and George Walton. From North Carolina was William Hooper, Joseph Hughes, John Penn. From South Carolina, Edward Rutledge, Thomas Hayward Jr., Thomas Lynch Jr., and Arthur Middleton. From Massachusetts, John Hancock. From Maryland, Samuel Chase, William Paca, Thomas Stone, and Charles Carroll of Carrollton. From Virginia, it was George Wythe, Richard Henry Lee, Thomas Jefferson, Benjamin Harrison, Thomas Nelson Jr., Francis Lightfoot Lee, and Carter Braxton. From Pennsylvania, it was Robert Morris, Benjamin Rush, Benjamin Franklin, John Morton, George Clymer, James Smith, George Taylor, James Wilson, and George Ross. From Delaware, it was Caesar Rodney and George Reed and Thomas McKean. From New York, William Floyd, Philip Livingston, Francis Lewis, Lewis Morris. From New Jersey, Richard Stockton, John Witherspoon, Francis Hopkinson, John Hart, Abraham Clark. From New Hampshire, Josiah Bartlett and William Whipple. From Massachusetts, Samuel Adams, John Adams, Robert Treat Paine, Elbridge Gerry. From Rhode Island, Stephen Hopkins, William Ellery, and from Connecticut, Roger Sherman, Samuel Huntington, William Williams, and Oliver Wolcott. And from New Hampshire, it was Matthew Thornton. Thank you. Happy Independence Day.